Earlier.
Can you say your name and count to 10, please?
Big pardon? Yeah, Louis V. Baldwin, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we have with us this morning to talk about the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Dr. Louis Baldwin. And of course, Dr. Baldwin, you've been with us on many occasions. Every time I come with you, I have to say that because people said, didn't I see him last week with you? And I said, yeah, because he's got all of the information that we want. And I think that what we are going to talk about this morning, dealing with the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, is very important in view of what is going on in politics and during the political season at this time. But Dr. Baldwin, let's go back further than this period. Let's look at the period immediately after slavery, when Africans were emancipated, and start from there and talk about not only the 15th Amendment, but say something about the 13th and the 14th Amendment to the Constitution and how important these amendments are.
Yeah, that's very important in terms of giving us some understanding of where we are today. The 13th Amendment in 1865 ended slavery. And not only in the rebel states, but throughout the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation simply ended slavery in the rebel states. But when you get the 13th Amendment in 1865, it ends slavery throughout the United States. Then you get the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to Africans, and the 15th Amendment, which was ratified in February 1870, really gave Africans the right to vote. Now, the problem is that voting was never up to the levels that it should have been between the period of 1870 up to 1865. We had to have the Voting Rights Act in 1865 to guarantee that most people of African descent in this country would have the right to vote and would be able to exercise that right. So with the 15th Amendment, 1870, a very important landmark in our history. Blacks were given the right to vote, but they were never able to vote up to the levels that they should have voted. And we had to wait, of course, until the Civil Rights Act, or the Voting Rights Act, rather, of 1965, which, as you well know, was signed into law on August 6, 1965 by President Lyndon B. Johnson. And that law, of course, did essentially three things. Number one, it guaranteed the right to vote. Number two, it created a federal authority to register voters in areas, jurisdictions where local officials had interfered with the right to register and vote. And thirdly, it restricted literacy tests and other examinations that were essentially based on racial discrimination, preventing people from voting. So that was a landmark. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a landmark achievement in the struggle for civil rights and also in the struggle for inclusive participatory democracy. It transformed the South in ways that the 15th Amendment, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments did not transform the South to the extent that you get with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where blacks are finally given an opportunity to participate completely in the civic life of the South.
And so in a real sense, Dr. Baldwin, we're talking about the so-called Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment to the Constitution playing a very, very significant role. Now, I think that many of our members of our audience might not be familiar with some of the efforts used by certain elements in the southern parts of the United States in the 1870s to keep Africans from participating in the suffrage. Now we're all familiar with violence, the Ku Klux Klan, and etc. But what were some of the things that were used at that time to sort of diminish the participation of black participation in politics?
The states' rights argument was quite prominent during that time. That is, that states should have the right to decide who exercised the ballot. But Southerners came up with a number of different tactics. They used the grandfather clause, which essentially argued that your father or grandfather had to have the right to vote and had to have property and education, that kind of thing. They came up with literacy tests, the poll tax to prevent Africans from voting in that time. There were also residential requirements, property requirements that were used to prevent Africans from voting. And of course, the states' rights argument was prominent in this opposition to black voting rights in that period. And of course, we get the same thing in the last decade with Republicans who are going back to the states' rights argument.
Okay, let's have a break here, Dr. Baldwin, then we'll pick up at this moment. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Because the 50th anniversary is important, but why is that important? Because we've got